Did the prophet Ezekiel predict Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Recently, with the events of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of attention drawn to Pat Robertson saying, listen, what Putin is doing, he's doing by divine compulsion to fulfill prophecy, and people pointing to Ezekiel 38 and 39 and saying this is in the Bible, this is something prophesied and laid out, in which case we are in the last moments of the last days.
91-year-old televangelist Pat Robertson came out of retirement for a quick reminder to the 1 million Christians who watch his 700 Club show. He says Vladimir Putin is being compelled by God. The Russian president was destined to bring about the end of times, prophesied in the Bible. He said Ukraine is simply a staging area for an even greater end of times battle that will eventually take place in Israel.
I think you can say, well, Putin's out of his mind. Yes, maybe so. But at the same time, he's being compelled by God. He went into the Ukraine, but that wasn't his goal. His goal was to move against Israel ultimately. And God is getting ready to do something amazing, and that will be fulfilled.
Is there any truth to that? How do we look at these passages in Ezekiel 38, 39? What does it tell us about Russia's invasion of Ukraine? What could come out of this could be massive. The implications, the potential of a World War III. What will the world order look like after this? Will it be much of the world against Russia and China, or Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, countries like that? Is that what's going to happen? Is that going to be the global shift? Where is this going to land? And we'll talk about Israel's role in all this. There have been requests for Israel to moderate and mediate the peace talks or ceasefire talks between Russian leaders and Ukrainian leaders because of Israel's unique relationship with both, with so many Jews in both countries and so much history in both countries. And Israel wanting to do what it can to stand with Ukraine as far as in humanitarian ways, medical help and things like that, various food supplies, etc., as opposed to sending weapons because of the situation with Russian Jews, etc. So we'll revisit that in a little while.
So before we get much further, let's revisit, first of all, what we talked about in my previous video on what might be the source of the first horseman of the apocalypse that we would have already had to have had happen before we start with the second horseman. I argued in my previous video that the coronavirus could be related to the fourth horseman, which is often associated with disease and death due to being a pale color. However, many of you challenged me in the comments section of that video, saying that it makes more sense that the first horseman could be representing the coronavirus due to the fact that he wears a crown, and the word corona is from the Latin for crown. Now in Revelation 6, this is what John writes. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, Come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Now traditionally, it is thought that this is the Antichrist, because he rides a white horse, he's trying to impersonate Christ, who will, by the way, ride a white horse later in Revelation. And I argued this point in my last video. I also saw the bow that he carried, which, by the way, has no arrows associated with it. It's just an empty bow, basically. I saw that as a sign that the Antichrist would be a conqueror, and he would conquer with a false sense of peace, hence no arrows required. And that sure sounds like our impression of what the Antichrist would be like, fooling a lot of people, including Christians. However, many of you argued in the comment section of that video that the bow represents the stealth way that the coronavirus is spreading and killing people worldwide. Instead of flinging obvious arrows, this conquest is accomplished without weapons, but rather it is a silent killer. Those are pretty good arguments, and you've got me thinking about that. I still think the rider of the first horse is the Antichrist. But let's assume that some of you are correct and the first seal was opened in late 2019, releasing the COVID-19 coronavirus onto the earth. Let's look at verse 3 of chapter 6 of Revelation. When the Lamb opened the second seal, and remember this is a scroll, and he's opening seals in the scroll. So the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword.
That in the end times, once the Antichrist has risen, Gog and Magog will ally themselves with the armies of Satan. They will join his army in the great struggle at the end of time.
First, let's take a look in Ezekiel, the 38th chapter. Ezekiel chapter 38. And we're going to look at it on the Sepharia website. We'd normally be looking at our Accordance Bible software, but we're going to look at this on sepharia.org because this will bring up some other Jewish sources for us. So the first verse, Vayhi dvar Adonai lemor, the word of the Lord came to me. Right? So this is Ezekiel speaking. What's the word? Ben Adam, O mortal, or son of man. Sim panecha el Gog, Eretz hamagog, Nasi rosh meshech v'tuval, v'hinave alav. So reading from the New JPS translation, O mortal, we're familiar with son of man. Turn your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. Prophesy against him. All right. So notice chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. Let's go over to Bible Gateway, BibleGateway.com. Let's look up Ezekiel 38:2, but let's look it up in all English translations that are carried on Bible Gateway. So if you look at the ASV, Son of man, set thy face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tuval. So notice the prince of Rosh. If you look at the Amplified, the prince of Rosh. If we scroll all the way down to KJV, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. If you'll see, the vast majority of translations do not say the prince of Rosh, but rather the chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. So most say the chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. Some, limited number of translations, say the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tuval. So let's just go back over to Sepharia for a moment. You'll see about halfway through the verse, if you could read Hebrew, Nasi Rosh. Now that could mean the prince of Rosh. And then Rosh, what's Rosh? Well, that must be Russia, correct? Rosh is Russia. And also Meshech and Tuval. Or he is the Nasi Rosh, the chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. The vast majority of translations understand that this has to do with Gog, Magog. So Gog, the leader of this land, Magog, what's that? What does it represent? Is it just abstract? Is it just powers of chaos and darkness at the end of the age invading Israel? Revelation 20 puts it after the millennial kingdom, when there's a final war. And again, Revelation is borrowing all kinds of imagery from the Old Testament, not necessarily in a chronological way.
This is once again shown in the book of Revelations. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth. Gog and Magog will gather for battle. In number, they are like sand on the seashore. They will march across to the ends of the earth and surround the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire will come down from heaven and devour them. The holy texts say that Gog and Magog and the armies of Satan may only be destroyed through divine intervention.
But there will be this end-time invasion of Israel, and then God will fight for Israel. We have that elsewhere, like Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14, and God will ultimately deliver Israel from Israel's enemies. But is this prophesying that Russia will be part of leading the invasion. So first thing is, no, it's not the right translation. It is not the Prince of Rosh, and now Rosh somehow equals Russia, but rather the chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. I just want to pull up for you a rabbinic commentary by Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, which is 800-something years old. And for those who can read Hebrew, wonderful. If not, I'm just going to translate for you. This is how he understands the Si Rosh, Meshech, Tuval. He says, Gog, hu melech Magog, he is the king of Magog, u melech shteha umota ele, Meshech v'Tuval. And he is the king of these two peoples, Meshech and Tuval.
After Satan has been bound and chained for 1,000 years, he will be unchained and rise up against God. He will then deceive the nations of the world. Satan will use Gog and Magog as part of his army and use them to attack Jerusalem. However, it is said God will send fire from heaven to destroy them. When the Antichrist rises, Gog and Magog will also rise and be set free. After, there will be a final battle between good and evil that will usher in a period of eternal peace. In the prophecy of Ezekiel, in the 38th and 39th chapter, it says, on a distant day, when the Jewish people are living in a secure Israel, Gog will invade Israel, and God will furiously retaliate against them. The invaders will be destroyed, and the Jews will spend months burying their dead. God declared that through the battle, the nations shall know that He is the Lord, and He is holy in Israel, and that never again will God's face be hidden. Both the Quran and the Bible prophesies the coming of Gog and Magog. When the end time is near and the Antichrist rises, he will have the support of not just humans that will be deceived by him, but also these terrifying forces. However, also in both texts, it says that they will be defeated by divine intervention.
So it is a mistranslation to say Prince of Rosh, Rosh equals Russia. That's number one. Discard that. Number two, what does this have to do with Russia invading Ukraine? Even if it was about Russia, Russia's been involved with invading different nations for many, many years and expanding its territory and former Soviet Union and all of that. You could have just said, well, the expansion in the past, that was Gog and Magog. It's got nothing to do with it. You say, no. But if you'll study it through, you'll see that it's a people coming from the north. Okay. When Jeremiah prophesied, Jeremiah 1, and God showed him a vision of destruction coming from the north. All right. So when that happened, Jeremiah 1, destruction coming from the north, that was actually Babylon. You said, well, I don't get that, because Babylon is like to the east and even maybe south of Israel and Judah. Correct. But in order to invade, you had to come all the way up around the Euphrates River and then come down. So you came from the north, even though you might have been in another place. It didn't mean that you had to be geographically north. And then Saphon, in Hebrew, north, that was in mythological literature, Canaanite literature, that was the place where the gods dwelt. In Saphon, Mount Saphon, they dwelt at the top of this mountain. So there's a literal Mount Saphon, but in mythology, this is where the gods dwelt. And then in the Bible, trouble comes from the north. It's the place of darkness. It's the place of disaster. So it doesn't even have to be a geographical place. All right, the Bible's saying, forget the myths, but there is destruction that comes from the north. And for Israel and Judah invading nations, unless you were Egypt coming up from the south, or Philistines from the southwest, otherwise you'd be coming down from the north, even if geographically you were just east or even south. You had to come around Euphrates and then come down. So the idea that somehow these prophecies relate to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unless someone was given supernatural insight and was told by the Lord that this is going to lead to this, which 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 is going to lead to eventually Ezekiel 38, 39, if we take them literally, which I do, even if there's symbolism in them. Ultimately, it's a literal war that's going to happen at the end of the age. There's nothing in the text to connect these.
Fiery red horse and its rider, who was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other with a large sword.
For the life of me, I don't get it, with all respect to Pat Robertson. I'm not saying this to bash him. I see no possible connection. By the way, when you look up scholarly commentary on Gog, Magog, there's a lot of discussion in terms of who Gog was in the past, represented in the future, what it will be. But Meshech and Tuval, here's one cultural background commentary in the Old Testament. At the end of the 8th century, these two Anatolian kingdoms were ravaged by internal warfare, conquered by Sargon II of Assyria and invaded by the Cimmerians from southern Russia. So they are not Russia. Meshech and Tuval were not Russia. They were Anatolian. Today, we'd equate that with parts of Turkey and those kinds of areas, but not Russia there. So Meshech and Tuval were not even Russia. In any case, it's just, there's no connection.
So what do you guys think? Leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. And regardless of how we interpret these horsemen of the apocalypse, through these tense times, may God grant you grace and peace.